Our final speaker of this morning is Annalisa Desmas, who is curator and department head of sculpture and decorative arts at the J. Paul Getty Museum. She received her diplôme de recherche from the École du Louvre and her PhD in art history from the Paris 4 Sorbonne. She is a former scholar of the French Academy in Rome, as we were just looking, at the Villa Medici, where she was then head for publications in the art history department. Annalisa has published extensively in her field of specialization, French and Italian sculpture of the 17th and 18th centuries, including her 2012 book, Le Ciseau et la Tiare, Les sculptures dans la Rome de Benoît XIII, Clément XII et Benoît XIV, 1724 to 1758. At the Getty, she contributed to the 2008 exhibition and the catalog Bernini and the Birth of Baroque Portrait Sculpture, and co-curated the exhibitions Cast in Bronze, French Sculpture from the Renaissance to Revolution, 2009, and Leonardo da Vinci and the Art of Sculpture in 2010. More recently, Annalisa has co-curated the exhibition of 2016-17 and its catalog, Bouchardon, Royal Artist of the Enlightenment. Her scholarly interests also include treatises on sculpture techniques in 18th century France and the history of collecting, as we'll hear today, in particular in Baroque Rome. Annalisa was part of the Getty Research Institute's project on display of art in Roman palaces and contributed to Gail Feigenbaum's edited volume for that in 2014. She's currently preparing a monograph on the sculpture Pierre-Étienne Monod, along with Andrea Bacchi, and the online catalog of the French sculpture collection at the Getty. But she's taken time out today to offer us her paper on the Galerie du S.R. Girardon, Sculpture Ordinaire du Roi. Please welcome Annalisa Desmas.
Good morning. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here, and I want really to thank Ian, Inga, Malcolm, and Samantha for the invitation and the organization of this fantastic symposium. Indisputably one of the most beautiful cabinets in Europe. It is in these words that Germain Brice, in his Guide of Paris, Description de la Ville de Paris, starts describing the collection owned by the sculptor François Girardon. Girardon's extraordinary rich collection was formed by an ensemble of roughly 800 sculptures and artifacts that the artist had in his home and atelier at the Louvre. In addition to the Guides of Paris, the collection is very well documented thanks to legal papers found by archivist Mireille Rimbaud in the early 1970s. From 1709, the sculptor started to lose his mind. His conditions kept declining to the point that he was declared unable to control his property. Consequently, his belongings were inventoried and locked in August 1713. Girardon died 2 years later, on September 1st, 1715, precisely the day on which Louis XIV died, quite a coincidence, and his probate inventory was drawn up in December of that same year, Nicolas Coustou and Corneille Van Clève being called as appraisers. Last but not least, the collection is also known thanks to a lavish print series that is traditionally entitled the Galerie du Sieur Girardon, and thus represents about 350 pieces. The inventories and the prints have been the object of scholarly studies by François Souchal in a very important article published in the Gazette des Beaux-Arts in 1973, and then in his famous dictionary, French Sculptors of the Reign of Louis XIV. The French Bronze Study Group relied on this material for discoveries that were presented in the Cast in Bronze exhibition and catalogue 9 years ago, and more recently, Françoise de la Mouraire contributed a chapter on Girardon collector in the monograph that Alexandre Maral devoted to the artist in 2015. And I truly encourage you to check his publication because it's full of new discoveries. Needless to say that my paper today owes much to all these important scholars, and in comparison will offer a very modest contribution. Within the context of this symposium, my intention today is only to propose a close examination of a print series in order to understand better Girardon's intentions in forming his collection and planning its display for the publication. The series is composed of 13 plates, all numbered and labeled, 5 are devoted to the gallery, 1 is on the cabinet, and 7 are the suite du cabinet. So here they are in the proper order of the series. The first 2 plates show the extremities of the gallery. Plates 3 and 4 show each side of the gallery. Plate 5 offers a view of the antique and modern pieces belonging to Girardon's cabinet. With plate 6, we come back to the gallery since it shows what is in the middle of that space. And then from plate 7, we have the continuation of the cabinet. These are the first 4 plates of this ensemble, and then the last 3 plates. Already in 1698, Germain Brice, while describing the collection in his Guide of Paris, wrote that a catalogue, I quote, would give the public much satisfaction if it could be published one day. In a later edition, dated 1706, he announced, I quote, "Very soon we will see a large volume of prints at which one works now diligently, which are designed and engraved with accuracy, and which will contain all the artworks of the master that are in great number." Most likely, the series was started just a few years earlier. Girardon asked his pupil, the sculptor René Charpentier, to draw the artworks that he wanted to see represented. The designer Gilles-Marie Oppenor, who is mentioned in the plate that shows the middle of the gallery, created the scenography and architecture for all the plates. 12 were engraved by Nicolas Chevalier. The last one, plate 13, by François Ertinger, may have been engraved a little bit later. And the royal cartographer, Desbrulins, took care of the descriptions dictated by François Girardon. Among the legal papers inventoried in 1713, one is a contract that Girardon signed with the print dealer Gaspard Duchange in 1709, and this attests that at that date the prints were ready to be published. For my images, you may have already noticed, I'm using 2 different sets. The images in color are the prints kept at the Bibliothèque Nationale de Paris, but since they are bound in a volume, the very long horizontal plates are separated in 3 distinct pages. So that's the reason why that for these, I'm using the prints kept at the Metropolitan Museum of Art instead, because they have the advantage of showing the size of a gallery on one single sheet. And so they are the ones in black and white. The series was actually not conceived, apparently to form a bound volume. In a letter dated June 1712, Daniel Kronström says, I quote, "There is no fronted space at the Galerie de Girardon, and there are doubts that it will be ever done." And no frontispiece was ever designed, actually, and the title commonly given to the series is the Galerie de Girardon. It's just taken from the captions of some of the prints, and we usually keep the double L, which is the 18th century spelling in French. The modern spelling is only with one L. Right away, the organization of the space, as it is offered to the viewer in the plates, but also through their captions, gives the collection a princely character. The gallery is traditionally seen as one of the most noble spaces of a residence, and it's not surprising that 5 prints are devoted to this space. One extremity opens onto a balcony. In everyone's imagination at the time, this balcony would have been above a park or a private garden. The other extremity, with a pyramidal shape and the use of a large tablecloth, would have most likely recalled for contemporaries the kind of display set up for silver services during important receptions, for instance. When one looks at the prints of the sides of Girardon's gallery, there is immediately an impression of a very elongated space. And the one featuring the middle of the gallery shows even columns, elements that automatically render the interior even more sumptuous. When we turn to the cabinet, sure, only one side is shown, but it appears quite clearly that its form is octagonal. Once again, this would have implied a large residence, and at the time it would have systematically referred to the Uffizi Tribuna or to other similar-shaped salon or grand vestibule. And finally, the suite du cabinet, with 7 prints showing distinct settings, makes the viewer imagine an enfilade of as many antechambers. Consequently, all these representations, rich of references to noble interiors and forms of display, make one assume that what is featured belongs to a prestigious residence or hôtel particulier, and I'm just showing the portrait of Cardinal Mazarin with a gallery of sculpture in the background. And all this floor plan showing the distribution of, gallery, you have salon ou cabinet, and then you have all these vestibules, antechambers, just to have a visual representation of what would have been a parallel to what you were able to see in the series. Needless to say that such an interior, as you all know, did not correspond to the reality. Girardon had his lodgings and an atelier at the Louvre from 1667. Sure, in 1677, he was able to move to a larger space, and there was indeed a long rectangular space, a sort of gallery with windows of both sides. I'm sure we'll be able to see. So that's the Seine. Okay, here. There is the actual pyramid, okay? And Notre Dame is over there, if you wish. This is the ground floor, so we are under the Grande Galerie of the Louvre. This space is actually, so enlarged here. So we are on the ground floor, so this is actually a passage from what was the Rue des Orties here and the Quai de Seine here. And so Girardon's lodging, he had, of course, rooms on the ground floor, and then on the upper floor, you have to imagine that above this guichet, this passage, you would have had what was called the gallery, with indeed one window on that part and one window on that part, but all the other rooms were actually vertically arranged on more floors. And then we know also from the inventories and from some of the descriptions that most part of his collection was in the atelier here, which is a courtyard that he would share with Cousteau. So here is the atelier, and he kept some pieces in the atelier, but also some in this separated cabinet. This overarching and overwhelming effect that so many objects do create in the print series actually hide the lack of consistency of the interior shown in the prints. Sure, many details make you feel that it is a real space, such as the clouds in the sky seen through the window behind the bust of Alexander, or more efficiently the representation of the projecting shadows of the statuettes on the wall behind them, or the projected shadows of some of architectural elements onto these objects. Yet it's quite interesting to view the prints in forcing ourselves to forget about the objects and to exclusively look at the architectural setting and light effects. Then it appears clearly that the view showing the middle of the gallery does not correspond to the views of the sides, as you can see quite clearly, I hope. Strangely enough, then the gallery would have had only one access, which is just this single door in the middle. It looks like that only one bay was open to the exterior. So that's my reconstruction. I mean, you can flip these two. I don't know exactly how we meant to have these two extremities. But when you check then the light effects, you just don't understand how it works, because let's say that the light comes from this part, then you understand this shadow here and that, but then you don't understand here. Well, here you have the shadow, so it just doesn't work as soon as you want to recreate a real space from these prints. Last but not least, albeit very elegant, this display would not be satisfactory at all. Objects you can see quite well on the prints, in particular the ones on the very top shelves, would have been hard to see due to a very strong Dassault Twinsu viewpoint from a vista, and due to their small size and sometimes also horizontal shape. And indeed, the dimensions indicated for Girardon's model of a statue of Jupiter allow us to understand that certain pieces were actually displayed on shelves that were 10 meters high. Try to imagine how you would have been able to see these things if you compare to this kind of dimension. And often the information given quite precisely in the captions happen to be surprising compared to how these objects are shown. For instance, it doesn't seem very practical at all to put a delicate relief in wax to decorate the bottom part of a door. More intriguing is the consideration of dimensions. So the prints devoted to the gallery have a scale featuring 3 pieds. The Ancien Régime pied is more or less the American foot, let's say. And others other plates indicate dimensions for some of the statues in the captions. At first glance, all the objects look proportioned to the large spaces in which they are set up. But when you look at plate 11, for instance, the architectural design is completely absurd when you realize that Bacchus and Venus are just statuettes, slightly over 1 foot tall, 35 centimeters. And while no dimension is given at all on the plate 8, when you consider that all these objects, except the two marble heads behind, are in terracotta, it is easy to assume that, once again, all the artworks are small-scale ones, and they would have never covered so much space in a room. The particular architectural setting shown in the prints may correspond perhaps to a specific wish that Girardon had. It appears that he didn't want his collection to be considered purely and simply as that of an artist, and this is quite striking when you consider the importance of some artists' sculpture collection in France in the late 17th century. In 1689, the bequest of Charles Erard enriched the French royal collection with a group of 70 or so statuettes, and 4 years later, in 1693, André Le Nôtre decided to give his collection to the king, comprising 30 groups, figures and vases. Not only Girardon gave his collection the rank of a noble one through a princely display, he also acquired objects so that his collection could be assimilated with the most respected cabinets of curiosity. This was a way to claim he belonged to this world of connoisseurs, who would not only look at Greek and Roman art, but who would appreciate also and study all the ancient civilization through a variety of objects. This part of the collection is not actually what we European sculpture specialists see at first in the print series, although some of these objects are actually represented. But not surprisingly, this aspect of the collection is highlighted in most of the descriptions we find in the Guides of Paris and in the letters and reports written by some important visitors. The Mercure de France, while describing the visit of the ambassadors of Siam, mentions a lot of ouvrages curieux, quantité d'autres raretés. Other descriptions are more specific. The British expert in medicine, Martin Lister, mentions many Egyptian objects, and in particular a lion in bronze and a seated man with a scroll on his knees. He also saw an intact mummy whose hand still smelt, a lot of urns and funerary vases, a very particular pen with 2 spirals ending with snakes' heads. Germain Brice had already mentioned a mummy in its entirety among the curiosities in his 1687 edition, but he decided to be even more comprehensive in his 1698 edition. Among the singularities, he described also votive lamps, idol figures, amulets that women used to wear to ensure their fecundity, and also objects that Egyptians would put in their tombs. Girardon even acquired a bust in bronze then considered to represent Isis that had been found in Paris in the ruins of a medieval tower just before 1675. Nearly all the guides do mention this artwork. The sculptor managed to resell it early on, reason why it is not on the prints. But we find it later in the Crozat collection and then in that of the Duc de Valentinois, who gave it to the Cabinet du Roi. Despite the efforts Girardon did to represent his collection as a princely one and as a refined and eclectic cabinet of curiosity, many characteristics reveal that only an artist could have put together such an ensemble of objects at the time and could have envisioned such a display for its representation in a print series. Obviously, the collection and its representation can be seen as an homage to the king whom Girardon served during all his career. At one extremity of the gallery, the portrait of the new Alexander, Louis XIV, in medallion crowned by 2 flames, is hung above the bust of Alexander. Louis XIV on horseback is shown in the middle of the gallery, and I am showing you the bronze that is identified by Françoise de la Mouraire with this version. And the socle is not the actual socle that was in the gallery. I'm just giving you here a similar example which is preserved. And at the other extremity of the gallery, 2 busts, never created as a pair initially, are shown as such to insist on the continuity of the dynasty. The bust of Louis XIV, acquired in 2010 by the St. Louis Museum of Art, and the bust of the Grand Dauphin. I'm showing the version that Françoise de la Mouraire considers the one represented on the print, but of course you have also 2 other very high quality versions, and one here at the Frick across the courtyard, and another one in Baltimore, but both were dated later by the French Bronze Study Group. And in between the head of St. John the Baptist, Girardon was very religious, but needless to say that a reference to such an important Christian image can also be read as critical in a gallery where the roi très chrétien is omnipresent. But directly linked to such a display is Girardon's ability to position himself and highlight his career. Girardon is in the middle of the gallery with Louis XIV on horseback and the two rapes groups, in between a masterpiece of antiquity, the bust of Alexander, because at the time the porphyry head was considered antique, and a masterpiece by the greatest artist of Renaissance, Michelangelo. That was the attribution of the head of St. John the Baptist at the time. Another obvious example is the group that Girardon created on the Old and New Testament, but that's the title he gives, it's not me, that puts together on the same so-called three small statuettes, one after Michelangelo, one by François Duquesnoy, and one by himself. But everywhere, I could show you many examples, everywhere in the gallery, in the series, Girardon does not hesitate to show his own creations next to ancient and late Renaissance artworks. The Prince series mixes art pieces that Girardon acquired as a collector with pieces he had because of his important role as sculptor of the king involved in all the royal decorations. Not only did he keep the models of his own sculptures, but he also had models from other artists he knew and worked with. In addition, as you all know, he also cast in bronze from models by these artists, such as Legendre and Poisson, and also from models he had after ancient sculptures. And let's precise that Girardon is quite transparent. Girardon is quite. Sorry, I knew what would happen. Girardon is quite transparent about this in his captions. He always mentions the artists, whom few out of France would have known at the time, actually. So only an artist could have accumulated such an ensemble of artworks, which most likely would have been kept in the workshop. And in the case of Girardon, the models he kept and the bronze versions he created were shown in the Prince series out of his working space, together with other prestigious pieces in the gallery and in the cabinet. And when I say models, one has now to take into account another particularity of the collection. Martin Lister, whom I mentioned earlier, saw in 1698 at the home of Girardon a room devoted to bronzes and another devoted to marble pieces. But there is no such distinction in the distribution of the artworks in the different rooms as they are described in the two inventories or as they are ideally shown in the prints. And in the Prince series, when you read carefully all the labels, you can realize that there is an incredible diversity of media with a mix of objects in bronze and marble, the most prestigious materials, but also in terracotta, wax, and in some cases alabaster and ivory. So I've just tried to represent this at least for one print, and I hope it gives you an idea of how it looked like. And in reality, so this would have given a very colorful display, which is quite amazing when you think of all the many collectors displaying later their bronzes with Chinese or Japanese colored ceramic vases to avoid dark masses of objects. Most likely significant in such a colorful effect was the role played by the bases. And that could be, actually a theme of one single lecture with all the bases featured on the Prince series. Girardon's care in displaying artworks is indeed attested by his attention to details such as circles and pedestals, and it's not surprising that some of them are detailed in the captions of the prints, so they are really incorporated in all the descriptions he's giving on the art objects. Besides his own terracottas or the ones by artists who worked with him, the most striking, perhaps, is the rich ensemble of artworks, 70 or so, by François Duquesnoy. With the wish to sell art pieces, the brother of the sculptor Jérôme Duquesnoy did several trips to Paris just before his death in 1654, and this is most likely how Girardon did acquire his works. Girardon really loved and collected them with care. He even told Nicodème Tessin, who traveled to Paris in 1687, that he had to pay one very small puteau, the quite important sum of 40 louis d'or. But an artist did show interest in terracotta models is not at all surprising. But what is critical, I think, is the fact that Girardon considered that all the small putties from Duquesnoy's hand should be featured on the prints together with ancient bronzes and marbles or late Renaissance Italian bronzes. Just want to step back. So there are all these little things. You see? These are the putties by Duquesnoy, for instance, just to show you how they are mixed with all the antique pieces. So there are not anymore terracotta models used by an artist in his studio for his own compositions and randomly kept on a shelf in his working space. By their proximity with prestigious artworks in the gallery, these models do form a terracotta collection within a larger collection. And in this act of display that changes the status of these models, and Girardon's contribution to this new taste for terracotta models that would explode in the 18th century France should be, I think, more emphasized. His models by Duquesnoy would later belong to very important collections, such as that of Pierre Crozat and that of his nephew, the Baron de Thiers. And let's recall that Girardon's prints date from 10 years before the creation of the Museo dei Modelli in the Vatican. More significantly, perhaps, is a very specific attention to represent a few artworks from different viewpoints. And since Girardon had enough sculptures to form pair, this cannot be explained at all as being just a way to play even more with asymmetrical effects. When you look closely at the prints, first, you notice that Girardon was quite honest. Indeed, he clearly stated in the captions, vue de deux côtés, viewed from two sides. And second, you realize that the objects that are offered from different angles are very specific. They show figures with twisting bodies, such as this centaur. This is a small wax modeled by Martin Carlier after the antique. An artist or a connoisseur would indeed be willing to see both sides of this torso, and same thing for a larger antique composition, such as this satyr in bronze. Of course, we also find more elaborated groups, and precisely those attributed to Gian Bologna, such as this Rape of Deianira, or the group, I'm translating the caption, group viewed from two sides representing a sleeping Venus and a satyr in bronze made by Gian Bologna and repaired by Susini, most likely Antonio Susini. But more often, the works that are being depicted with several viewpoints are by the hand of François Duquesnoy. These are either small-scale objects, such as this Puto holding a crown in bronze, or larger statues, such as this other Puto standing. But the most compelling example is perhaps in this plate, in which you are being offered no less than 3 different viewpoints for the exact same, I quote, child riding a lioness seen from 3 angles. To such an extent that in this particular context, symmetry matters less than this piece being shown in from 3 different angles. This Duquesnoy group is lost if we rely on Marion Boudon and Françoise de la Mouraire. It is hard to say whether the proportions were always accurate for the representation of the statues in the prints, but at least if we compare to a standing Bacchus, who is said to be 13 pouces tall, so approximately 13 centimeters, 1 foot and 1 each in American dimensions, the group represented from 3 viewpoints would have been less than half his size, so very, very small. Albeit quite rare, we know of a few examples of prints overcoming the difficulty to represent a complex work in 3 dimensions. And we can think of Andrea Andreani with a group of Rape of the Sabines by Gian Bologna, or Muller with Mercury and Venus by De Vries, composing 2 different prints to show each viewpoint. But in these cases, the statues are considered as isolated masterpieces in each print. To my knowledge, the rare print series offering several viewpoints for the representation of a statue were treatises on the body proportions studied on antique pieces, and even the books that Malcolm showed in his key lecture, very rarely they show sculptures from different angles. Girardon took a special care, actually, in having his own artwork represented through prints, and many were listed in his inventory. And it appears that he didn't want to limit some of his artworks to a single viewpoint representation, and I think it is quite compelling to compare the existence of these 4 prints of the tomb he did of the Cardinal de Richelieu and the several viewpoints representations of some of the sculpture of his collection in the print series of the gallery. So, as I've tried to show, the nature of Girardon's collection offers many facets. The numerous antique marble statues, medallions, and busts, together with the late Renaissance bronzes, form a quite traditional princely collection. The variety of some rare artifacts makes it appear a cabinet of curiosity. And all the models by Girardon and his contemporaries, together with the bronze cast by Girardon after some of them, are just the result of the production and, of a prolific and important artist under the reign of Louis XIV. What is truly unprecedented is Girardon's display in the print series of all of these different ensembles combined together as one collection, and his care also to give all the objects the same prestigious status. He showed them in the most important space of a residence that he purposely named in the captions, Galerie, Cabinet, Suite du Cabinet. He positioned them with much care, created piers, conceiving refined circles and pedestals. He labeled them precisely, and he represented them from different angles for the ones that required more attention according to his sensitivity as a sculptor. In having a print series created and published, Girardon made sure the fame of his collection would be widely spread and conserved for posterity. But in a certain way, his series belongs to a print tradition that Louis XIV started to establish in France with prestigious volumes on Versailles, the gardens, the grotto, the ceilings, and the paintings collection. Yet, his care to represent the artworks, not separately, but in an ideal setting, is quite exceptional. As you know, the collection was easily accessible, advertised in many Parisian guidebooks, and visited by many eminent figures. The King William III of England even planned to acquire it. Although dispersed after Girardon's death, the art pieces entered important collections, and the artist's fame remained important all along the 18th century. Nonetheless, it's astonishing and, in particular, very disappointing for us art historians that his print series did not prompt collectors to follow his steps in asking for a visual recording of their belongings as they were displayed in their residencies. And it is indeed quite a paradox that Girardon, who did not have the means to display his rich collection in a grandly manner, conceived an ideal setting for this collection through a print series that, despite its diffusion and fame, remained quite unique in the history of collecting sculpture. Thank you.